Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I stopped being my family's unpaid safety net the night my mother asked me, with her fork in midair, when I would finally catch up to my brother. It was one of those questions that sounds innocent if you hear it in passing, but when it is aimed directly at you in a room where everyone already knows the answer, it becomes less of a question and more of a dig wrapped in casual small talk. We were sitting in the same family restaurant we had been going to since I was a teenager, and as always, I was the one who quietly picked up the check at the end of the night because you're doing fine, honey, you don't mind, do you? Except that night I minded, because my mother had just praised Evan's brand new housewarming like it was a royal coronation, and then turned to me with that look that always meant she expected me to explain why I had not measured up to her standards yet. The thing was, I had already hosted my own housewarming almost a year ago. It wasn't a big affair, but I had invited friends, coworkers, even a few neighbors, and we had filled my living room with laughter, cheap wine, and homemade food. The only people who had not been there were the ones sitting across from me at that dinner table, the same ones who were now asking when I planned to catch up. So I smiled, maybe too calmly, and I said, I hosted mine last year. You just weren't on the guest list. Her fork froze in midair like someone had pulled the plug out of the wall, and for the first time in years, I saw a flash of confusion in her eyes that wasn't immediately smoothed over with polished control. That was the moment something in me snapped into place. I wasn't angry, at least not in the way I had been before when I went home and cried out of frustration at never being enough. I was done. Done letting them nibble away at my paycheck with little temporary arrangements that became permanent. Done funding Evan's flights when he accidentally charged them to the card I once let him use for emergencies. Done covering the family phone line add-ons, the extra streaming subscriptions, the storage unit full of boxes no one visited but me, and the small mountain of shared accounts that all quietly build to my name each month. I didn't throw a scene at dinner. I let the silence settle, paid the check, and drove home without saying much more. But the entire way back, I was planning. The thought that repeated in my head like a steady drumbeat was simple, no more. By the time I parked, I had already texted Maya, my friend who happened to be an accountant, and told her I needed help pulling receipts, canceling authorizations, and setting firm end dates for every favor I had been carrying. She sent back one word, finally. That night, instead of scrolling through my phone until I passed out, I logged into every account I could think of. I started with the easy ones, the premium channels I never watched, but Evan insisted he needed, the cloud storage plan my mother used to back up endless family photos, but never paid for, the little add-on apps my father downloaded, just to try, and then forgot about. I cut them off one by one, screenshotting the cancellation confirmations and filing them into a folder labeled Returns. I didn't even bother to warn anyone yet. I wanted the silence to turn into a question before I gave them an answer. The essentials I kept alive for 2 weeks, but I scheduled hard deadlines. The phone line would switch back to the base plan. The utility bill would be transferred. The storage unit would be vacated. Nothing was dramatic or loud, it was surgical. I wanted it all neat and documented, not so I could wave it in their faces, but so I could stand firm when the storm came, and I knew it would come. By the time I closed my laptop, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if the weight I had been carrying on behalf of everyone else was finally being lifted, piece by piece. I wasn't naive. I knew the messages would start rolling in as soon as someone lost access to a login or got a notice about transferring an account. But instead of dreading it, I was almost excited, because for the first time in my life I wasn't going to explain, justify, or apologize. The next morning, 2 certified envelopes went out, one addressed to my parents, one to Evan. Inside was nothing fancy, just a clear list of accounts, the amounts I had covered, and the exact dates when each one would no longer be my responsibility. I even gave them the courtesy of instructions for transferring everything into their own names. No drama, no insults, no "you owe me." Just deadlines. And as I dropped them into the mail slot, I realized this wasn't about teaching them a lesson or forcing them to grovel. It was about reclaiming the space in my own life where their voices had drowned mine out. This was me saying no without yelling, drawing a line without begging them to see it, and stepping back from the table where my only role had been to serve. Because when my mother asked me that night when I was going to catch up, she had no idea I was already ahead. She just didn't like that the race I was running no longer required her applause. And when those envelopes landed in their mailboxes, they were going to realize something else too. Access to me now came with a cost, and for the first time in their lives, they would have to decide if I was worth paying for. And that was only the beginning. By the time the certified envelopes had left my hands and the adrenaline of that small private rebellion had settled into a clean, steady focus, I was already at Maya's kitchen table with my laptop open and a thick stack of printouts that felt like a biography of my invisible labor, because if you ever want to know who you are in a family, look at what you pay for when no one is watching. And there it was in black and white, month after month, the add-on phone lines and upgraded data plans. Because my mother likes to stream shows at night, the premium channels that only my brother ever seemed to need but somehow lived under my name, the cloud storage where decades of photos had been parked because no one wanted to deal with sorting them, the emergency airline ticket that had never been repaid and had quietly rolled into a balance I chipped at while Evan posted vacation pictures, and the storage unit whose rent clicked over like a metronome while I was the only one with reminders. Set 2. Visit it, clean it, and keep it from being auctioned off. Maya, who has the patience of a saint wrapped in the brain of an auditor, poured coffee and asked me to start at the beginning, and, because she knows me well enough to recognize when I am tempted to apologize for breathing, she cut me off the moment I tried to explain why any of this made sense at the time, saying that explanations are stories we tell to make other people comfortable, while receipts are the story we tell ourselves when we finally decide to live in daylight. So we built a timeline, month by month, and every line got a date, an amount, and a status, active or closing or closed, and we kept going until the table was covered with a picture that was impossible to argue with even if you wanted to, which I no longer did. When the spreadsheet was finished and organized into tabs that even my mother could navigate if she chose to, I drafted an email that did not ask for gratitude or promise a fight, an email that simply said, "Here is what I've paid for over the last several years. Here are the accounts in my name. Here are the dates by which they will be ended or transferred, and here are the exact steps you can take to assume what you want to keep." And then, because I have learned that clarity is a form of kindness even when people call it cold, I added one sentence at the end that said I will not be funding shared expenses anymore, not because I am angry, but because continuing to do so has made me smaller. And I do not plan to live small in a life I am building without permission, and I hit send before I could edit the heat out of it. The responses were as predictable as seasons, with my mother arriving first, dressed in wounded politeness that read like a press release about family values, telling me that money is not everything and that I seemed determined to cause a scene when there could have been a private conversation, and that she had always supported me in spirit even if I preferred to keep score in dollars, which was the kind of line that sounds reasonable until you remember who has been using the card reader. My brother followed with a flood of charm, promising he would square up soon and that I knew how things had been tight during renovations and how he would never take advantage of me. It was just that I was in a better place, and he had assumed I did not mind. And while I could hear the familiar tug of that word assume trying to drag me back into the old choreography where I dance and they clap, my feet did not move this time. Instead, I opened the banking app and removed Evan as an authorized user on the card that was once meant for emergencies, but had become a tab at a bar he did not pay. I filed freezes with the credit bureaus because I have seen how quickly a family can create a surprise in your name when you stop being useful, and I set alerts that would ping me if any account tried to breathe without my permission. All of it quiet and done within an hour, not with revenge in mind, but with the kind of protective calm you feel when you finally lock a door you never realized had been standing open since childhood. Then I turned to the storage unit, that square of air I had been renting so no one would have to make a decision about objects that had long outlived their meaning, and I scheduled the closure for the end of the week, arranging for the boxes to be delivered to the owner on file who was not me, because that detail had always been a running joke about how I was the organized one and my mother was the sentimental one. And it turned out the system actually remembered that fact even when we pretended it did not, so I boxed the last of the photos, scanned the documents that mattered, kept a small folder for myself labeled proof because Maya insists on evidence like oxygen. And I handed the keys to the driver who nodded and said he would be careful because he has learned that what looks like junk usually breathes fire when it lands where it belongs. Before bed, I sent one more message, this one to the family group chat, calm and clean, saying that from this week forward there would be no accounts in my name for anyone else, no keys or codes without boundaries in writing, and no promises I could not afford in peace. And while the 3 dots bubbled like water about to boil, I turned my phone face down and let the night do its work, because I have learned that silence can be a tool when you are finished explaining yourself to people who like you best when you are useful. In the morning, the first thing I saw on my screen was a photo from my mother, a shot of stacked boxes on her porch with the caption asking what she was supposed to do with all of this, and I looked at the picture for a long moment, feeling the weight of things I had carried because no one else wanted to lift them, and then I typed a one-sentence answer that did not tremble, pressed send, and watched the message move across the screen like a line in the sand that, for once, I did not plan to step back over. When my mother texted me that picture of the stacked boxes on her porch with the sharp question of what she was supposed to do with them, I knew instantly that the entire weight of years was contained in that single moment. Because those boxes were not just cardboard stuffed with old photographs, yellowed papers, and knickknacks no one wanted to claim. They were proof of how long I had been the one who silently absorbed responsibility, while everyone else convinced themselves that my willingness was the same as my consent. I answered her with the simplest sentence I have ever sent her, take care of what you kept, and then I placed my phone on the counter, letting the silence stand in for the argument I refused to have anymore. Because explanations only worked when both sides wanted to hear the truth, and in my family, truth had always been rewritten until it sounded like flattery for the people in charge. It did not take long before the family group chat lit up, because Evan, who cannot resist inserting himself into any drama where he thinks he might play peacemaker or victim depending on which angle makes him look better, chimed in with an emoji-free but guilt-laden paragraph about how I was overreacting, how family always helped each other, and how dragging everyone through this list of receipts and deadlines was turning private matters into public battles. Then came my mother's carefully crafted lines about how none of this was necessary, how she would have handled everything quietly if only I had come to her first, and how she was concerned about the tone of my messages. My father, predictably, said nothing at all, because silence has always been his refuge, and it struck me in that moment how easy it must have been for him to let the burden fall on me. Since silence costs nothing but often extracts everything from the person who refuses to pretend anymore. So I did something that felt strange even as I did it. I posted a timeline directly in the chat, not with commentary or anger, but with cold, clean entries that said things like, phone line added to my account, May 10 years ago. Monthly cost shouldered since then, or storage unit in my name, maintained at my expense, closed as of this week, or emergency airline ticket charged to my card, unpaid balance settled by me within 6 months, and I ended the list with one line. This is what happened. These are not opinions. These are dates and amounts. For the first time, there was no room for argument, because the story was not being told through memory or perspective. It was being told by receipts, and receipts, unlike people, do not change their minds depending on who is listening. My mother's reply was defensive, a polished attempt to reframe history so that she still appeared generous, claiming that they had supported me in other ways and that counting dollars was cold. But the truth was that she had relied for years on the unspoken agreement that I would never hold her accountable in public. Evan sent a message that tried to weave humor into guilt, suggesting that maybe I was preparing a Netflix documentary about our dysfunction, but the silence from my father spoke louder than both of them. And for the first time, I felt like maybe he understood that my patience had been cut off at the root and there was nothing left for me to give. That weekend, I changed the locks on my front door, something I should have done years ago when I first realized that my mother had kept a spare key without asking, and that Evan had let himself in more than once with some flimsy excuse about convenience. I updated the security system, revoked the old codes, and added a door camera, not because I expected them to come barging in, but because I needed the symbolic weight of that boundary to become real. There is something powerful about knowing that your home is no longer a revolving door for people who take more than they bring, and when I slid the new keys onto my keychain, I felt like I was finally holding something that belonged only to me. Evan, of course, did not take the hint. He held another one of his loud gatherings at his new house, filling the street with cars that overflowed into neighbors' driveways and left tire tracks on lawns, and when I saw the pictures on social media of the crowd spilling out onto the sidewalks, I remembered all the times I had quietly paid HOA fines myself because family shouldn't fight with family, and I realized that even silence can be complicity if you allow it to keep repeating. So instead of ignoring it this time, I filed a courteous, policy-based report to his homeowners association, pointing out the repeated violations and attaching time-stamped photos that had been posted publicly by his own friends. It was not revenge in the way some people might think. It was a statement that rules applied even to the golden child, and if that meant his party cost him a fine instead of me, then justice had finally shifted in the smallest but sharpest of ways. The timing was perfect, almost too perfect, because the letter with his fine landed the same day as the certified envelopes I had mailed, and suddenly his charm-filled messages grew sharper, edged with panic, because when the safety net folds, the acrobat realizes how high he has been flying without ever learning to land. My mother called me dramatic, her favorite word when she wanted to shrink me back into compliance, but instead of defending myself, I answered with a single word she had never heard from me before: accountable. That word hung in the air longer than any lecture I could have given, because accountability is a mirror, and mirrors are not flattering when you have spent your life avoiding them. For once, I was not the daughter who absorbed the cost, or the sister who patched the holes, or the quiet caretaker who kept the family machine humming without recognition. I was the woman holding up proof, drawing boundaries, and enforcing consequences, not with shouting or tantrums, but with the steady weight of reality that no one could edit away. And as I sat in my newly locked home, sipping coffee while my phone buzzed with half-hearted protests and awkward silences, I realized that this was not the end of the war, but the beginning of something far more dangerous for them. A version of me that did not backtrack, did not explain, and did not fold just because they refused to face the truth. I had finally stepped out of the role they had written for me, and in its place, I had written my own. And once you see yourself clearly in that mirror, there is no going back. The morning after the fine landed in Evan's mailbox and the word accountable echoed through my mother's phone call like a brick dropped into still water, I sat across from my father in a quiet coffee shop where the hum of espresso machines drowned out the silence that had lived between us for years, and for the first time in my life I did not feel the urge to fill the space with explanations or apologies, because the weight of what I carried was already printed on the single page I slid. Across the table, a page Maya had titled with the blunt precision only she could deliver, "What I paid for so you would not have to." On that sheet were the amounts, the dates, the accounts, and the totals that stretched back over years of so-called temporary arrangements, and my father looked at it not with shock, not even with anger, but with the quiet fatigue of a man who finally had to admit that he had known pieces of this truth all along and had chosen silence, because silence was easier than confrontation. He did not try to defend himself, which was almost worse than if he had, because his acknowledgement that he had allowed this to go unsaid more than any argument could. He admitted, in a voice so low I had to lean in to hear it, that he had been aware of some of the expenses, that he had suspected the rest, and that he had chosen to let it happen because he told himself I was stronger and could handle it. A twisted form of flattery that in reality had been a mask for neglect. I told him calmly that the door to my life was not locked, but that entry now came with conditions, and I laid them out as clearly as I could. First, an apology without spin or performance. Second, the replacement of the phone line into their own names so the financial leash was cut clean. And third, the return of every spare key they had ever kept to my home, because access without respect was not access at all. It was intrusion dressed up as familiarity. He nodded, Not with the performative agreement I was used to from my mother, but with something that felt closer to resignation. As if he finally understood that the version of me sitting in front of him was not going to bend back into the role of caretaker he had grown comfortable relying on. When he left, he did not say much, but hours later an envelope slid under my door with the spare key I had forgotten he even carried, and in that simple act I saw the smallest crack of accountability break through decades of avoidance. And it startled me enough that I kept that envelope on the counter for days just to remind myself that change, even small and reluctant, was possible. My mother, however, did not see it that way. When she heard about our meeting, she exploded into messages, accusing me of humiliating the family, of dragging private matters into the open, and of weaponizing money as if my calm record of transactions were some kind of cruel trick rather than the only language they had ever chosen to understand. She said I was ungrateful, that I was tearing the family apart, that I was making her look like a bad mother, and while once those words would have pierced me so deeply that I would have rushed to soften the blow with apologies, this time I let the accusations roll past me like static, because what she called humiliation I called sunlight, and what she called ungrateful I called free. I did not argue with her. Instead, I forwarded her a calendar invite titled Guest List Policy, and in the notes section I wrote a single sentence that I knew would cut sharper than any lecture. If you belittle me in private, you do not get access in public. It was not a threat, it was not a punishment, it was simply the new rule of my life, a policy as clear as the ones in the workplace or in the homeowners association, except this time the rules were mine. And I was not interested in enforcing them through guilt or debate, but through access, because access to me was no longer free, and if she wanted to be present in my home, in my gatherings, in my world, she would have to understand that disrespect did not come with an audience. Evan tried to laugh it off when he saw the invite, making jokes about my corporate boundaries and how I was treating the family like employees, but his laughter rang hollow. Because he knew as well as I did that rules written down carry more weight than rules whispered in anger. For the first time, they were all staring at terms that were not negotiable, and it terrified them because for decades the only person with boundaries in that family had been my mother. And now she was facing the shock of realizing that her daughter had built sharper, cleaner walls than she ever had. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable, and while the group chat fizzled into silence, I sat in my kitchen staring at the returned key in its plain white envelope, realizing that this was not just about bills or locks or spare codes, but about something much deeper. I was no longer willing to play the role of daughter as resource, the endless fountain they could draw from without gratitude, because the truth was that I had been living two lives, the one they saw and the one I built, quietly behind the scenes, and the only difference now was that I had stopped hiding which life I planned to keep. And as I thought about that, I smiled at the irony that my mother had always asked when I would finally catch up, never realizing that the finish line she kept dangling in front of me was one I had already crossed in silence, and that from here on out, if she wanted to be part of the view, she would have to step through a door whose lock she no longer controlled. By the time the calendar invite with my guest list policy had sat unopened for a full day and the returned key lay on my counter like a small metal verdict, I realized that there was one truth I had been circling without saying out loud. A truth that explained why my answer at that dinner table had landed like a slap and why my mother's fork had frozen midair, because the housewarming she praised for my brother was not about a new address or new furniture. It was about status and spotlight and the feeling she gets when she can parade one child as proof that she did motherhood right, while quietly using the other child as the scaffolding that holds the stage together. And what she could not process was that I had already dismantled that scaffolding in silence and built a life somewhere she could not see. So when she asked me when I would catch up, she was measuring me against a ruler that no longer applied. And the only reason she was shocked by my answer was because she had not noticed that I had stopped competing a year ago and started living instead. What I did not tell her that night, and what I had only shared with a few people who had earned the right to be there, was that when I signed the papers on my small place last year, I did it with a trust that had only my name on it. Set up with clean advice from a lawyer Maya recommended and funded by the money I saved by saying no to every upgrade and indulgence I did not genuinely want, because peace, I learned, is cheaper than applause and far more valuable when you are the one paying the bill. And in those first quiet weeks, I made a decision that felt almost radical in a family like mine, which was to celebrate without asking anyone for permission. So I invited the people who had shown up during the years when I was a wallet with a smile. The coworkers who brought soup when I was sick and did not ask for favors in return. The neighbor who carried a bookcase up 2 flights of stairs because he saw me struggling and did not make it a story about himself, and Maya, who, in the absence of a mother I could rely on, became a kind of sister who measured love in spreadsheets and tough questions, and the occasional shove toward the life I said I wanted. We ate and laughed and drifted in and out of the rooms that were finally mine, not because the deed said so, but because the air felt like mine for the first time. And I remember standing in the doorway and realizing that nothing about that night needed to be validated by the people who would have turned it into a critique. And that was the night I quietly decided to keep my home off their map. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I wanted to see what it felt like to thrive without the constant reach of a hand that only extends to take. So when my mother later asked about catching up, she was really asking for an invitation to a life she had never supported, and my response was the first honest boundary I had given her in years. When I finally sat down with her after the storm of fines and receipts and rules, I did not go in to negotiate, because negotiation is what you do when both sides are willing to give something up, and I had already given up enough to fund a second household. So I laid out the last offer I would ever make, and it was short enough to fit in a single breath. Acknowledge the harm without excuses, transfer the phone line and close the loop on every account in my name, and return the last of the keys you have hidden like trophies. And then, if you can do those 3 things without turning the story into your performance piece, I will consider inviting you to the next dinner I host, because access is not a birthright here, it is a relationship built on respect. And if respect is too expensive, then absence is free. My father, who had already slid his key back to me, nodded and said that he would handle the line transfer that week, and while I knew better than to carve hope into stone, I let myself feel a small warmth for the man who had often been too quiet to be useful and was finally choosing action over the safety of stillness. Evan offered the same old lines about paying me back someday, and how I knew his heart was good even if his follow-through was a mess, and I told him, without malice and without softness, that intentions do not keep lights on, and that from this point forward he would need to manage his emergencies without drafting me into them, because I had my own future to protect, and it did not include being his cushion. As for my mother, she tried one last tactic, the one where she tips her head and asks in a wounded voice whether I truly intended to cut her out over something as small as money, and I told her the truth she did not want to hear, which was that money had never been the issue, that the real currency had been respect, and that she had been overdrawn for years. And when she opened her mouth to spin that into another accusation, I stood up, walked to my desk, and took out 3 cards I had already stamped, because sometimes the only way to end a conversation is to let the mail speak, and I handed her the one addressed to her, while the other 2. A thank you to the friends who came to my quiet housewarming and a note to my father for returning the key without theater would go out that afternoon, and I told her she could read it later or not at all, but that the message would be the same either way. When she finally opened it days later, she found a photo taken at my kitchen table last year, one empty chair pulled out at the edge of the frame with a simple sentence beneath it that said, "You always asked when I would catch up, and I did." I just stopped inviting people who make me run in circles, and although I did not witness the moment she read it, I could imagine the fork in midair and the frozen smile, not because I wanted her to hurt, but because I needed her to understand that the door to my life now swings on a hinge she cannot see and cannot control, and that if she wants to step through it, she will have to learn a language she has never had to speak, the language of accountability without applause. That evening I set the table for the kind of dinner that does not need to look perfect to feel like home, and as my friends arrived and the room filled with the low hum of people who show up because they want to, not because they are keeping score, I looked at the one empty chair and felt no ache, only the clean, startling quiet that comes when you finally choose yourself without needing an audience. And while some part of me will always hope that my family learns how to knock and wait and enter without taking, the rest of me understands that victory, the kind that lasts, is not about their repentance, but about my refusal to live small. And that is how I won, not by getting louder, not by setting fires, but by closing the accounts that kept me bound and opening a door that only people who respect me are allowed to walk through, which, as it turns out, is the only housewarming that ever mattered.